Kerete. So I want to say before we move right into the lesson that depending on how things line up, one, I'm going to be away for 2 class periods toward the end of this quarter and then come back after Christmas and we'll have 1 class left together. Depending on how far I can get before my family and I travel, I will either be finishing up what I would like to already have done, or if there are specific questions that you think might be answered by something in the Greek, maybe an English translation that you're curious about, let me know about those, and we'll kind of go through and see if we can figure out as a class how we might go about answering those kinds of questions within Interlinear. So just keep that in your mind over the next couple weeks, and if you want to dig into something, we can work through that together as a class in the final class period. Obviously, as you can see, we've gone somewhat slower than anticipated, and so I am not going to get through even the beginning material that I intended to get through, but hopefully we'll have some foundation for moving forward. I want to say just a couple more words about participles before we come to the odds and ends. I want to clarify a couple of things that maybe we were just kind of breezing through in the last class. So we have mentioned that participles are usually translated in English as ing verbs, if you will. Now they are participles, but sometimes we don't necessarily use that terminology in our everyday vernacular, but think of it as an ing word. Now there are, as I think we talked about at the end of class last period, there are nouns that end in ing, but we're talking about verbs that you stick an ing on the end. And so learning, finding, jumping, these kinds of ideas. And so that's the most basic way to translate a Greek participle. But something we have to think through a little bit more as we think about Greek participles is that because they are verbal adjectives. Remember we said infinitives are verbal nouns, participles are verbal adjectives. They're going to be describing something, either the circumstances or a noun, if you will, or they're acting as a noun. And so in that sense, they're going to have characteristics that are associated with adjectives, and they're going to have some characteristics of verbs. So if we look here on the chart, we notice that some of the verbal ideas are that they will have tense and voice. That is, they can be present. Rarely in the New Testament, they can be future, then aorist, or perfect. So whatever we talked about with present, aorist, and perfect verbs as far as aspect is concerned, that transfers right over into participles. So if present was kind of ongoing, repeated action, you can kind of think that with present participles. If an aorist was just kind of up in the blimp, kind of seeing the whole picture, not thinking about it going before you or anything like that, you take that same aspect and you apply it to the aorist participle. If you get a perfect participle, just as in a verb you would have past action that has present result or present relevance, you take that same aspect and you apply it to the perfect participle. So we're kind of building on our verbal system. And as we saw with verbs, you have voice, that it can be active, that it is doing the action. It can be passive, that it is receiving the action. And then in Greek, it can be middle. And we're going to talk more about middle voice in just a few moments. So it can have those characteristics. You think about it in this way. If you take the verb, hitting, the participle hitting, hitting would be a present active participle probably. And so the man who is hitting the ball, notice that he is presently active, or he is progressively, or it's showing the picture of an ongoing action, and he is the one who's doing it. But if it's the man who was being hit by the ball, notice that you can still have that same aspect, but now he is the recipient of the verbal idea. So we have those same parallels between verbs and participles, but participles are also like adjectives. So they can be defining something, just like we had the man who is hitting the ball. You could have case, gender, and number with the participle. That it could be nominative, genitive, dative, or accusative, especially if it's agreeing with the noun that it's connected to. It could have gender. If you're talking about a masculine noun, or let's even just say a man, you would use a masculine participle to describe that man. If it's a woman, you would use a feminine participle to describe that woman. So I think we had up here something like the hit, it would be almost literally, I don't think we had this on, but using the last example, the hitting the ball man. Notice how you're describing what man you're talking about. It's the man who is hitting the ball, the hitting the ball man. But that hitting participle in Greek would have to agree with man. You couldn't throw in a feminine. It would have to agree with the masculine gender of the noun. And then the number is singular or plural. So if you have the man who is hitting the ball, the participle has to be plural to agree with the man. But if it's the men who are hitting the ball, then you have to have a participle that agrees with the noun. It has to be plural. So notice how we're kind of carrying over some things from nouns and also some things from verbs. We kind of skipped over adjectives a little bit. We didn't go in depth, but they have the same characteristics as nouns. So when we call it a verbal adjective, just recognize that you're using a verb to describe something. So it's going to be acting like an adjective, but it is a verb in a sense. And so you have to have these various ideas that are agreeing with whatever it's describing. All right, that being said, what I want you to think for now is if you come in your interlinear to a participle, say, can I translate this as an ing verb? If you can, that's the best way to do it. And I don't know why, I think I miswrote something here. Let me come back to that. I don't want any confusion. Sorry if I'm messing you up, Bryce. All right. There we go. So with the present, you would have establishing. The man who is establishing the faith, or the God who is establishing the faith. You're just going to try a simple ing participle. And what you need to think is, if it says the God who is establishing the faith and it's in a present, what does the present aspect usually convey? Progression. So if that was written in the Bible, the author wants you to think this is an ongoing activity of God. He is the God who is continually establishing the faith. But if he used an aorist, the God who has established the faith, it's just kind of undefined. So the God who has, notice there that whenever you tie it to God, it's kind of hard to just say the God having established. Really what that would be, if you wanted to put it in English, and really it's bad, the having established the faith God, because it's acting as an adjective to describe God. But we have to play around with it a little bit. So you're trying to convey the idea. And notice that I have having established with aorist. Because though you're looking at it from a holistic idea of, he doesn't want you to think God is continuously establishing, even if God does continuously establish, he would just want you to think the God who establishes or who has established. Notice, though, the most basic way you would do that is having established. Why? Because you're putting it as kind of antecedent action. That is action before the main verb in the sentence. To rephrase this a little bit, again, this is poor English, but you could have establishing the faith, God saves us. And so God is this kind of the subject. Now notice that you could, having established the faith, God saves us. See how that kind of pushes it back before? Establishing the faith, God saves us, kind of shows it as action at the same time, if you will. The same time as the saving is the establishing. But if you say having established in Greek or in English, you're portraying that this is something that happened before. And that's really what's happening with an aorist participle. And then perfect is too tough to really dive into tonight, but we'll leave it as either established or having established for now, and we'll maybe come back to that later. Any questions or comments about participles?
This is relevant. The other day in class, you said we wouldn't say the going. That is, we would say the person who is going or he who is going. Two prayers since then in this auditorium. Somebody said, be with the traveler. Two separate prayers. Be with the traveler.
Right.
Pay attention to that.
Yeah. I'm not saying it's completely, it's not bad English all the time, but it's not necessarily specific English sometimes. The going, well, what do you mean by the going? It just doesn't sound right. The traveling sounds a little bit better, but it just kind of depends. And that's an English thing and not necessarily a Greek thing. They could just say the going, and they would understand based on how it's formed what they're talking about.
I never would have noticed it before.
Yeah, sure. Any other comments or questions? All right, I said we'd talk a little bit about middle voice. This is one of the odds and ends of the verbal system that we kind of have glossed over. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but I'm just going to say that English does not have anything exactly parallel to the middle voice in English. The middle voice in Greek can reflect that this is something you are doing to yourself, but very often it does not. So it can have a reflexive idea, like I hit myself is how we'd say that in English. So you are the subject who is hitting, but you are also the object of the hitting. So that's one way you could kind of portray that with a reflexive idea. You could also portray it as, in Greek, what it really is doing is somehow the subject is affected by the verb. It's not just the boy hit the ball, because really that's just the subject hit and the ball received the action. But the middle voice in Greek is really trying to suggest somehow the subject, though he even might be doing it to something else, is still affected by the action. And I'm going to give some examples in just a moment. But as I have highlighted up here, some kind of subject affectedness or participation in the verb. And Matthew 27:5 has a reflexive idea, which is the rare use. But then Ephesians 1:4 shows really a true middle voice. And I'm going to have this on the screen in just a few moments. But it says, God elected us. Elected is in the middle voice. And what that seems to indicate is that God chose us, but he did so with him being affected by it as well, that he maybe chose for himself us. And so you have some interesting ideas there that I'll dig into when I have an example up on the screen. But I just want you to be aware that there is a middle voice. And if it sounds weird, it is very rare in the New Testament as well. So you're not going to be coming across it all the time, except with one exception. And here's where it is. There are a lot of middle voice verbs that are not truly middle voice. And what that means is it's not trying to portray subject effectiveness. It's not trying to show reflection. What it is it's basically equivalent to the English word I become, or I go, or I pray. They will, in the Greek, they will put that in the middle voice. And even though we would translate it in a somewhat active idea, like I am going, those kind of verbs, you can't, here's a good test. Can you put it in the passive? Could you say, I am went? You probably wouldn't say that, would you? You just say, I go. And so if you have this middle voice verb that is only in the middle voice, it's probably because it is this, what is used to be called deponent. Did any of you guys who ever learned Greek hear deponent verbs? Okay. That's really something that a lot of Greek scholars are getting away from description. That's a good way to describe Latin, but it's not a really good way to describe Greek. But basically what this is it does not have an active form. So for example, the word that's always used is, as a paradigm, is luo, which means I loose. That's active. You could have a object with it. I loose the chains. So here's an active ending. You could put that in a passive ending. I am being loosed. Passive. So I am being loosed by the jailer, something along those lines. There is the ending for that. And I'm not making you memorize endings. I'm just showing you that you have an ending here for the active, I loose, or I am loosing, and you have another ending which shows that it is passive. I am being loosed. Now, does that look similar? It's because it's identical in form, but this is actually the middle form as well in Greek. And it's I loose for myself. Basically how we could translate that in English. And context will let you know if it is, like I said, this is very rare. Now, here's how we can tell the difference. Look at these words right here. If you look that up in the dictionary, that's what you're going to see. You're going to see that ending right there. You will never see that active ending. And what that tells you is this is a middle-only verb. So if you see that ending in your lexicon, in your interlinear, ome, then that tells you this is a middle-only form, and it will not have an active form. And if it doesn't have an active form, then it is not going to have a true middle form. It's going to be one of these quote-unquote deponents or middle-only, which is words like I become, I go, I pray. These are words that only occur in the middle, and you shouldn't translate them as I become for myself, or I go for myself, or I pray for myself. You just translate these middle onlys as I become, I go, I pray. And usually when you click that word in Thayer or something like that, it'll give you the middle only form, and then it'll give you a translation that sounds very active, but is actually middle in form. So you can see why I saved this for odds and ends, because it's not something that you need to pay close attention to, other than to note that you have some very common words. And when I was studying Hebrew, as kind of a side project, I was also watching the DVDs for the textbook, so I was learning from two different teachers at the same time. And I liked a phrase he had in Hebrew that also applies in Greek. He said, the most common words are usually the most irregular words, that they're going to be the strange ones. And so become, go, pray, very common words in the New Testament, and they're some of the weirdest because they don't have an active form. They only have a middle form. So those will be there. I haven't looked on Blue Letter Bible to see if they try to put deponent or anything like that, but it may give you some kind of indication to don't translate ginome. If you see that ending in it, it'll probably say something like deponent, or I may even spell it out for older things that would be on that. I prefer middle only as the terminology. And what it will do is it'll give you a translation that just says, I become. It won't give you a middle translation, I become for myself or anything like that. Don't get too hung up on this. I just want you to be aware that it's there. If you're in the interlinear and you see a middle form, what you need to be looking for is if it says present middle indicative. I think that actually shows up as PMI. Then if you see present middle indicative, first thing you need to do is click on that word and see, does the original form end in O for active or ome for middle only? All right, and I'll show you an example here in a moment. And I kind of mentioned all this already, but use the interlinear to find the lexical form. That is the dictionary form that will, as you'll see here, you got your form right here that is your original form. See that one? It ends in O instead of ome. But what you're going to do is you're going to see, does it end in omega or does it end in omicron, mi, alpha, iota, ome? If the dictionary form ends with ome, don't translate it as a for myself. Just translate it as an active for now. All right, and here's what I mentioned. Try to put the verb in the passive. If you can't do it in English, there's a good chance that it's a middle only. You wouldn't translate I go as I am went. You don't have that form, so that's why you can translate it as an active even when it's middle. All right, so I want to spend a little bit of time looking at a couple of words here in Ephesians chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. And we're not going to translate through every word. We actually have spent a little bit of time in this text. I just want us to look at some of the participles and verbs here. This is actually, notice here we have an adjective. Blessed, implied is or be, the God and Father of the Lord of us, Jesus Christ. Then we have the article the. So the, or we could translate it who. And then we have this verb here. Verb, aorist, active, participle, nominative, masculine, singular. Now, so nominative, masculine, singular. Here's what I want us to note first. If you were just reading this in English, blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us. Who does the who refer to? To whom does the who refer to? It refers to God. That's what the Greek shows us with clarity, because if it was genitive singular masculine, then it would agree with Christ. But because it is nominative singular masculine, we have to go back and find the last nominative singular masculine, and you've got God and Father, or God, Father. This is actually a construction that means it's the same one, the God and Father. And so that helps you to know who the who is. It is God is the one who blessed us. Also, it is an aorist active participle. When we have an aorist participle, what aspect does the aorist give us? Yeah, complete, undefined. And so he doesn't want you to think of God who is continually blessing us. He wants you to think of God who has blessed us. And this is kind of he just wants you to think God blessed. That's the idea. God blessed. And because it is active, who is God blessing, or is he being blessed? He's the one doing the blessing. So that may seem quick for you because I'm just going through it quick, but if you slow down and spend 5 minutes just really digging through and thinking through each of those concepts, each of those little letters with your little parsing sheet, or just hold your mouse over it, you would have to start to think, well, why did he use an aorist? Well, because he just wants me to think of the whole action of God blessing. Why is it in the active? Because God is actually doing the blessing. It's not that he is being blessed. That's what's happening up here. I am blessing the God and Father, or he deserves to be blessed. He is the one who has blessed. And just as a side point, notice that you have the same root here. You have the verbal root, blessing, and here you have the adjective with the same root, blessed. And so you have blessed all the way through here. But the one who has blessed us. So he is actively blessing us, or has blessed us, if you want to think of it that way, and it is God who is doing that. Somewhat ambiguous in English, very clear in Greek. If you just slow down and spend a little time, it tells you who's doing the blessing, how the blessing is to be considered, and that then it tells us who the recipients of that blessing are. It is us, who has blessed us. What has he blessed us in or with? In or with every blessing spiritual. Every spiritual blessing. Every blessing spiritual in the heavenly places in Christ. Notice how many times we have that preposition, in. It's going to be very common here in this opening section. But I just want us to think through that participle. And the only way to get better at it individually so that it doesn't take you 10 minutes to work through that is to do it yourself. I will tell you, whenever I was just learning Greek, that first year, I had to dedicate, and this is usually the common number that's given, you have to get up mornings, evenings, whatever you choose to do. You have to spend an hour a day in the first year to really get a good handle on Greek, just to learn the language. And there would be times when I'm doing my homework, and I just have to sit there and look at that. And what was harder is that the teacher wouldn't allow an interlinear. You just had to go back and look at your paradigms and try to memorize it. But what we have here is that by slowing down, thinking through it, yes, it will take 5-10 minutes to really parse that word for yourself. But the next time it may only take 9.5. And the next time it may only take 9. To the point that you get to where you look at that and you say, oh, I know what an aorist means. I know what an active means. I know what a participle is trying to convey. It's trying to connect it, trying to describe who God is, what he has done. And so you pick that all up, but it's going to take time. And then the time gets lesser and lesser so that you can actually spend time looking at the things you want to look at instead of just trying to figure out the simple things. Now, bringing us to verse number 4. Notice here we have just as, and then he chose or he elected. Notice this even kind of, let me get the right letter here. I'm breaking off the first part. Sato. E-L-E-K. You can almost see elect. We get our word elect from this. That whole concept of election, divine election, comes from this word. He chose. But notice here that you have he chose us. This is an aorist middle indicative. Now, I want to look here for just a second. So if you have your interlinear, you can bring it up. But we're looking at chapter 1 and verse number 4. I want to click on that. Notice here that you have a couple of ways of looking at this. If you click on the word elect, notice that it says that your most basic form is ek, leg, o, me. What does that ending tell you? Middle only. Now, that is how some people see it, and that very well may be. But I would invite you to scroll down to Thayer. And what do you see there? What's the first form you see?
The very first form I see is perfect passive participle.
Okay, before that, what ending do you have there? I would say you would be okay by saying this is middle only, because it probably is in the New Testament. Thayer is telling you that outside of New Testament Greek, it does have an active form, which may suggest that this is not just God chose, but God chose for himself. Maybe it's a true middle. And these are things you just have to kind of think through and read some good commentaries and see. Either way, you'd be okay translating it, he chose. And so that's something to consider. But I want you to see that you have this middle-only form, at least as they see it that way. And thus, he chose is the good translation. He chose us in him before the foundation of the world, literally before foundation of world, but this preposition probably means not just any old foundation of the world, but there's only been one. So it's the foundation of the world. Notice here we have, he chose us in him to be. This is a present active infinitive. Now, how do your English translations translate verse 4? Would be? Read the whole phrase there for us.
He chose us in him, but this is the LSB. Chose us in him before the foundation of the world, that we would be holy and blameless before him.
All right. So they're taking that infinitive and saying that we would be. But you could also translate it, he chose us to be. Chose us to be. Us is connected there, but to be. What does that show? Infinitives can show purpose. So why did he choose us? He chose us to be something. So it's not that he just chose us, but he chose us to be something, or that we would be, as a fine translation to show purpose, that we would be what? Holy and blameless. Where? Before him in love. In love could go with the next sentence. But regardless, what we're seeing here is that God chose, maybe he's choosing and he's affected by it as well if it's a active form, but he chose us for a purpose. He chose us to be. So what we're seeing is we're seeing a participle, we're seeing a middle verb, and we're seeing an infinitive, the last couple of things we've studied in these two verses, showing us God is the one who blesses, God is the one who chose, and he chose us for a specific purpose. Might that make a pretty good 3-point sermon or invitation? You're working your way through the text, and you see just by the verbs or the participles some key ideas that the author wants you to think about. All right. Any other questions on that?
Earlier, you had mentioned something about agreement,
Mm-hmm.
and then back in verse 3, you mentioned blessed. And you talked about the non-singular masculine. Is that true that you can expect the participle to agree in number, gender, and
Yeah, case.
case?
Yeah, absolutely. If there is a noun it's modifying, it will agree in gender, number, and case. So the interesting thing about participles in Greek is that he could well have, if he wanted to talk about Jesus being the one who blesses, he could have put that in the genitive. He could have said, the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, and then put in the genitive, who, with Jesus, has blessed us. But he didn't want to focus on Jesus blessing us. He wanted to focus on God blessing us. And so he had it agree with this noun instead of this noun and pronoun. Any other questions? If participles seem overwhelming, just remember that quote from Machen. That is the hardest part of Greek. And we really don't have time to dive in. Whenever you learn Greek, for the first time, and like when you're actually memorizing endings and everything, you probably spend a good month just on participles. We've spent 2 or 3 classes. And so I just want the terminology before you, not full understanding at this point. We can work through that later. All right, I want to go to the next slideshow. We actually made it through this part. I was hoping we would, but I'm glad we did. So let's go to the next PowerPoint here. Okay. We don't need to say that again. All right, so let's do a little bit of review. Let's all say the alphabet together. Alpha, Beta, Gamma, Delta, Epsilon. Oh, it gets quieter. Zeta, Eta. Epsilon. What do we have? Sorry? Phi, Chi, Psi, Omega. Very good. What do the endings on Greek nouns tell us? You don't have to memorize the endings, but they do tell us something. Case. And what are our cases? Nominative, genitive, dative, accusative. I'm going to ask some more questions about endings. But what does the nominative tell you? Subject. Genitive, possession. Dative, accusative. See, you're remembering more than you thought you did. All right. So it tells you the case. What else do the endings of nouns tell you? Number. What does the number tell you? One or more than one, singular or plural. All right. And then what else does it tell you? Person. Wait. Case, number, gender. So it's going to be, what are our 3 genders in Greek? Masculine, feminine, neuter. Very good. Just remember, with those with those genders, it may not have anything to do with actual physical sexual gender. Love is feminine. That doesn't mean it's necessarily a female quality. Just think that you do have these various forms. It will sometimes agree if you are talking about personhood, but it doesn't always have to. What do the change of endings of Greek verbs tell us? Tense? Tense will be part of, or aspect will be part of tense. Voice, very good. And we had one more word, starts with an M. Mood. All right, the tense is going to tell us in the indicatives, mood, something about time, past, present, future. It'll also tell us mainly something about aspect. Is this ongoing repeated action? Is this undefined or just holistic action? Or is this stative, as in past activity that has a present result, the perfect? And then, so we have tense. Voice tells us what? Who's doing the action? Is it active, middle, or passive? The main ones you want to focus on are active and passive, because middle is somewhat rare, and even if you have a middle-only verb, you're going to translate it as an active anyway. And then, so you have tense, voice, and mood. What does mood tell you? Reality. Are something that's real, or something that could happen, or something that you want to happen? Those kinds of things are portrayed by the mood. And then, what is meant by the phrase lexical form? The form you find in the dictionary. So that's going to be that one that we're looking for. Does it, do you find Leo, or do you find Leome? Those are your only two kind you're going to find, either an active or a middle lexical form. But it's the first word that you see in the dictionary, and it carries the basic idea. All right. Explain what each of these Greek moods express. Indicative, real, subjunctive, possibility, optative, wish, yeah, less possible, wish, imperative, command, participle. It's not actually a mood, but I'm putting it in with moods. It's a verbal adjective. It's a verb that's acting as an adjective. It's describing either a noun or an unexpressed person, or it's being used adverbially to describe the circumstances in which someone is doing something. What is meant by, well, we already talked about that, but active, middle, and passive. Active, you're doing it. Middle, you're affected in some way by it. Or passive, that you are being affected by it directly. All right, good job. You know, you may feel overwhelmed, but notice when you start going back, the fog has lifted in some areas, hasn't it? You know, you're getting there. Very good. I probably don't have time here. What I'm going to do is show you the next slide, and this is what we're going to talk about for the next several classes, because this, I think, is really where most people want to get when they learn anything about Greek is, how do I take that and study a word in my New Testament? Or how do I see how that word fits into a context? So what I'd like us to do over the next several class periods is figure out how to do good word studies. Here's the thing. People have done a lot of bad word studies. And I want to show you some things that will keep you from doing bad things with your Greek. You know, the common expression is, I know just enough Greek to be dangerous. Well, what I want to do is say, yes, you may have just enough Greek to be dangerous, but let's put some rails in place so that we don't go off the edge. All right, so we're going to talk about word studies next time. Appreciate everyone's participation.